our classrooms. And that's great. We will get that for sure in this session. But along the way, I think one concept that we all can use, no matter where we are in our careers, is to reflect on our practices. So if nothing else, I think we'll all walk away with some ideas related to teacher reflection. So let's begin there. Teacher reflection. You know, the idea of being reflective and thinking about your practices is nothing new. I mean, John Dewey talked about it 80, 90 years ago. And for Dewey, the notion sort of went like this, that our actions are really only educational when we reflect on them. You know, without that reflective component, our actions are more like a habit where we just sort of wander through the day aimlessly doing our routines. And so it was that reflection that was an essential quality of making our actions an experience, or an educational experience, as Dewey might say. Well, that was 80, 90 years ago, and lots of people have expanded on Dewey's ideas since then. Very notably, Donald Shawn, who sort of is credited for popularizing the phrase reflective practitioner. But other folks have written about it as well too, including Farrell and J.N. Johnson. But I'm going to use Barbara Laraby's work when I talk about 4 levels of teacher reflection, because I think Laraby does a good job of sort of synthesizing all of those ideas that have come before. And so Larrabee talks about these 4 different levels of teacher reflection. The first level being kind of a surface level. You know, this might be where your main concern is about classroom management and keeping students on task and reaching sort of pre-established goals. You know, often we're in the surface level of reflection earlier in our careers, and we go back to surface reflection from time to time, for me, particularly when I teach something new. So surface reflection is more about classroom management, and you're not as focused on the curriculum, but rather how are you able to manage the curriculum. The second level of teacher reflection for Larrabee is pedagogical reflection. And this sort of involves deeper thinking related to teachers' beliefs about good instruction. So now you're aware of your educational philosophy, you know what you think is good instruction, and then you're able to then think critically about your practices and whether or not those are congruent with your philosophy, and then you're able to make those appropriate adjustments as necessary. Now, the third and fourth levels of teacher reflection get really, really tricky. One is critical reflection, and that's when teachers become aware of sort of these inherent social, political, and cultural injustices embedded within institutional systems, which includes schools and includes fine art systems. And you become aware of these injustices, and you make efforts to address them in how you select and engage students in planning curricula. And then the fourth level is really tricky. Larrabee calls that self-reflection. And that has teachers thinking more deeply about social injustices, but this time inwardly about how our own assumptions may have been unconsciously shaped by unacknowledged cultural privileges and family imprinting. And that's tricky. And it's tricky because we're often unaware of them. You know, it's these unacknowledged cultural privileges that are hard to even be aware of because you don't even know they're there. Maybe it's been normalized by society. So 3 and 4 can be really tricky, and I push myself to get into 3 and 4 as often as I can. And sometimes I've tried to do it very formally, but it is hard. For example, I wrote about it once in 2014 in an issue of the Journal of Cultural Research in Art Education. More recently, I tried a presentation related to self-reflection at the Art Education Research Institute, and maybe that one was a little bit less successful, but I do try and push myself to go there. It is hard, messy, and slippery work. It's not easy. But what I remind myself when I try to do it is, as hard as it is, it's probably easier than what a lot of underrepresented populations might be experiencing when they're living those social injustices. So there's a brief review of these 4 levels of teacher reflection. And we're going to use those 4 levels of teacher reflection to look at the unit that I'm going to share with you today. So maybe for that reason, we're going to call this a classroom disaster, along with the topic of natural disaster, because we're going to look at it critically. To be honest with you, it's not a complete disaster, or else I wouldn't be sharing it with you. So let me show you why I picked the unit that I did choose. I wanted to pick an older lesson that I had previously taught. That way it would be ripe for reflection and ready for an update. In fact, the beginnings of this unit or lesson I'm going to share go back to like the mid 1990s, and I've taught it a couple times in the past. Even though it's an older unit, ripe for reflection rather, I still wanted to make it a enduring concept, something that's still related to an enduring concept, something that's still relevant to students' experiences and lives. I mean, if it wasn't still relevant to their lives, then it would be time to put that idea to bed and not return to it. I wanted to do something that was age appropriate, but they had possibilities for being scaled up or down for older age groups. In our previous webinar series, our previous episodes of the webinar series, folks shared with the audience high school and middle school lessons. So this time I picked an elementary lesson that I do think could be scaled up and down. And if you listen real carefully right now, you can hear all the high school teachers logging off because they're like, no, it's an elementary lesson. Just hang with me. I do think that this unit, because it addresses an enduring concept, easily is adapted to the middle school level. And we're going to talk about ways in our reflection about moving it all the way up to the high school level. So don't log off yet. Also wanted to pick a unit that could be implemented easy, something that could be adapted for students learning from home with limited supplies. After all, this webinar series is about art education for critical times, and I understand the circumstances with which some of you are teaching right now. And this unit that I am sharing does have interdisciplinary options, but I also wanted to pick something that could be a standalone art lesson as well. During these critical times, perhaps you don't have the opportunities to collaborate with, say, somebody in another subject area. So this could be interdisciplinary, or it could be a standalone art lesson. So the unit that I'll be sharing has to do with natural disasters, which I do think is an enduring concept. And at different times, we have referred to it as the impact of environmental forces on our lives. I did teach it in the mid to late 1990s, and more recently in the aughts in around 2007. I taught it in collaboration with my lovely wife, Monica, who at the time was a 5th grade homeroom teacher. Now, because we're talking about an interdisciplinary lesson, or what sometimes people call an integrated arts approach, I wanted to make it really clear up front the ways in which Monica and I were approaching this interdisciplinary unit, because there's all sorts of different types of integrated approaches. For the sake of time, I won't walk you through all 4 of them, but I did want to acknowledge that the approach we were using was largely thematic, where we picked out an enduring theme or an enduring idea that we thought could be explored through work coming not only from the arts, but from other subject areas as well. And since we're on the subject of an integrated arts approach, I would also say how important it is to me when taking this approach that the arts have a co-equal status with the other subject areas involved in the unit. We wanted the arts to be on equal footing with the other subjects involved in this interdisciplinary unit, rather than a subservient role, rather than a secondary role. And the folks that I'm citing here, for example, that labeling of subservient or co-equal, that's from Leora Bressler, and I'm citing Elliot Eisner over here. And those are getting to be dated references. You know, Bressler's article is all the way back as a seminal publication from '95, Eisner's from 2002. So if you're into interdisciplinary approaches, there's lots of other folks that you can look at that are more current. And I do really, really like Julia Marshall's work on integrating the visual arts across the curriculum, if you're interested in that. A lot of my colleagues at FSU are doing great work that is interdisciplinary in nature. Sarah and Rachel do lots of great work with integrating civics and using civic engagement, for example. But our approach was thematic. So let's talk a little bit about that theme and how we're approaching the theme of natural disasters. So remember, the first time I taught this unit was in the 1990s. And one of the key concepts of that unit was the idea that natural disasters are real events that impact real lives in very real ways, not like that were glamorized in action adventure disasters movies. And as such, the resulting devastation to humankind should be a real concern to all, even when that event is not directly local. And art and other subject areas can be used to explore how others have faced and depicted such natural disasters, to personally reflect on such experiences, and to uncover introductory understandings of the inner workings of environmental forces. So the first time I taught it in the 1990s, I was an elementary school art teacher, and I just noticed that there were a couple homeroom teachers that were covering natural disasters in their classrooms. Through a little communication, I picked up on it, and I decided to approach that theme through visual art in my classroom. To be honest with you, it wasn't very collaborative. I just kind of picked up on what they were studying. We had some cursory communication, and I ran with it back then. But it was the 1990s, and visual culture art education was getting to be real big at that time. And certainly you could notice this influence of this sort of glamorized action adventure disaster movies was huge in the mid 90s and moving on into the early 2000s. You know, Twister came out somewhere around then. Titanic was huge, although that was kind of a machine meets nature kind of scenario. But of course, that was a huge movie. And, you know, with CGI coming around and with the success of those movies, then, you know, Hollywood does what it does. And out came a number of movies like Volcano, Perfect Storm, Armageddon, Deep Impact, Dante's Peak, the list goes on and on and on, which sort of glamorized this thing instead of looking at it as real things that happen to real people in devastating ways. So, and you can even read the taglines here that kind of have that sort of, the coast is toast. Earth, it was fun while it lasted. Heads up. You know, it sort of was taking these real things and sort of turning them into something that was glamorized. So that was when I approached it in the 90s. Then later in the 2000s, when I do this unit with my wife as a collaborator, it was around 2007. So circumstances had changed a bit. This is now a year or two after Hurricane Katrina, which I think really changed how people looked at the devastation that comes along with natural disasters on a bigger scale. And so we taught this unit a couple years after Katrina. And in terms of this being an enduring idea, I do think it's one that can be scaled up and down to any age level, because it's something that we're always going to have to deal with. You know, in 2020, it was a record year for landfalls regarded to tropical storms and hurricanes. I know we have many, many Floridians in our audience today. Although Florida was not completely unscathed, we made off better than we have in the past, which is not to make light of folks that did experience some disasters. Certainly our folks and friends out in the West Coast in Pensacola certainly had a rough go with Sally, and all throughout the Gulf Coast. And this happened in the middle of a pandemic. And there have been times in the midst of this pandemic where you know, I've kind of lost my head, right, about everything going on. And then I've had to back up at times and say, you know, but I'm very fortunate. Imagine what all these communities experienced in the middle of social distancing, in the middle of everything going on in the world, that suddenly you've lost your home, or you've lost power, or you've lost electricity. And it also seems like the news cycle often moves on from these topics much quicker than they used to, whether you want to call it a 24-hour news cycle or whatever. Often it's covered quickly and then not addressed while the people in these communities are still suffering. This makes me think that this topic it doesn't just have to be about natural disasters and environmental forces. It could easily fit in with a much longer unit related to compassion and empathy and care, which some of you know is a topic that I'm very passionate about. But the time we implemented this unit, we had just moved to Georgia, and I had accepted a job as a university professor at the University of Georgia, where I was a professor of art education. And my wife was a fifth grade teacher in the local community. And when we moved to Georgia, she began planning for her fifth grade curriculum. And she was going over the Georgia science standards. And she came across Earth and space science standards for the state of Georgia. She was learning them all because we had moved from Florida. And she came across Earth and space science standards related to the impact of constructive and destructive processes, where they specifically cite examples related to seismological studies and flood forecasting. So she was going over her curriculum before we started our new jobs, and she came across this. And so Monica said to me, as we were pre-planning and getting adjusted, she mentioned this to me, and she said, I remember when you used to do that unit back when we taught in Tampa in Hillsborough County. And she said, I'm seeing these standards in science. Would you like to try this again here in Georgia? And I was game for it. I was excited. While I had been getting my PhD, I hadn't been able to work closely with my wife. When we had taught together in public schools in Hillsborough County, we taught at the same schools. So this was exciting to work with her. It was exciting to be reflective and readdress an older unit that I taught, now with this new lens of thinking about Hurricane Katrina. And so I was eager to do this with her, and we both approached it in a co-equal way. So she began the unit in her classroom, a 5th grade classroom, on natural disasters. And yes, it was a science standard that spurred her to think about it, but along the way, we're constantly checking with each other in the different subject areas to do our best to keep those subject areas on a co-equal status. Since there are so many Floridians in our audience today, there are, of course, Florida standards related to natural disasters. If you ever get to a point where you're able to collaborate with a colleague in another subject area. In 5th grade, there's one about designing a family preparedness plan for natural disasters and to identify the reasons for having such a plan. And then those standards kind of ramp up in the subsequent years. You know, in 6th grade, there's a standard about investigating how natural disasters have affected human life in Florida and to describe ways human beings protect themselves from hazardous weather, and et cetera. And, you know, those standards kind of build on each other from that point forward. So I do think that those opportunities for interdisciplinary connections are ripe for all the Floridians in our audience today. And of course, I should mention the Florida standards in the visual arts. I won't dwell upon them. I think that our standards in the visual arts in Florida are broad enough that you could approach this topic from a number of different ways. And here's just a few. But I think by the time we're done with the critical reflection of this lesson, it could easily shift to a different set of standards. I will point out that this bottom one does lend itself to interdisciplinary connections. Connections among the arts and the other disciplines strengthen learning and the ability to transfer knowledge and skills to and from other fields. So I think that's enough about standards. Forgive me. Let's talk instead about how Monica and I put the unit together. And Monica did start in her classroom first by integrating science. And she broke her students up into teams to work collaboratively. And each team was assigned or selected a natural disaster that they were going to investigate and research. And then these teams, in the sort of divide and conquer approach, were going to report back to their classmates all about the particular natural disaster that they researched. And my wife is not an art specialist, but she does try to weave in some of the arts along the way and leave her lessons open-ended. So as this team was researching a natural disaster, they had choices and options as to how they were going to share that information with their classmates. And some of the ideas she gave them was they could share the information through a skit or a TV commercial, or you could do a poster or a good old-fashioned radio show or a comic book. You can see several options they had there. So she sprinkles in the arts when she can as well too. The groups are also asked to create a natural disaster simulation. So as a team, they had to come up with a way to simulate the natural disaster for their classmates. And in this process, you can kind of guess how some of them approached it. Some of them did go with the old tornado in a bottle thing or the old baking soda volcano thing. But some of them got really creative. And I remember in visiting her classroom, one group in particular sticks out that they built like a whole little model city and put the city over 2 different tabletops that were to represent how plate tectonics work. And they would then use the 2 tabletops to show that action and sort of simulate what can happen to buildings. So some of them did get really creative with their simulation, and others did sort of stick to those sort of tried and true examples we've probably seen in the past. She integrated language arts into this process as well too. It wasn't just in science. In language arts, she picked 2 focus novels that went along with the unit. One of them was a work of historical fiction, and one was nonfiction. Both were about earthquakes. And she chose 2 different focus novels as a way to differentiate her instruction. Students could select the book by their interest. You know, did they want to read a work of fiction or of nonfiction? And also the books were on slightly different reading levels as well too. So sometimes she did sort of encourage students to go one direction or the other. I'll briefly mention that Earthquake at Dawn, which is the work of historical fiction, is an interesting little scholastic book. It has a connection to art. It's historical fiction, but one of the side characters in it is an actual person, Edith Irvine, who was a photographer and a teacher, and is well known for being a photojournalist who took most of the pictures of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that was so infamous. We'll hear a little bit more about Edith Irvine a little bit later. I just wanted to touch on what she did in her classroom because most of you are here to hear about how visual art fits into it. So I would visit Monica's class on Fridays. I would come from the University of Georgia and visit her class and stay as long as I could on Fridays. And one of the very first things I did once they had the unit rolling was I just came in and we just talked about art. And I showed folks some different images of artworks that had natural disasters in them. It was nice to come into her classroom after the unit was already going because they sort of had some foundational knowledge about natural disasters at this point. So now I'm going to ask you all to play along a little bit and do a little bit of role playing. I'm going to show you some of the images that I showed to the 5th graders, and this won't be tricky, but I'm just asking you to play along. So get ready to unmute yourselves. I'll show an image, and just like a 5th grader, you can point out to me what disaster you think is in the image. And the first couple are really, really simple. So let's give it a go. And I'm counting on you on that. All right, here comes the first image. What disaster do we see here?
Tornado.
Tornado.
Yeah. All right, tornado. I love it. Thank you all. Yes, tornado, easy one, right? This is John Stewart Curry's Tornado over Kansas. Let's go to the next one. What do we have here?
Tsunami.
Tsunami, I was going to say tsunami.
Well done, tsunami. And it was interesting talking to Monica's students. And of course, this image is iconic now, right? The Great Wave, Katsushika Hokusai. The students right away, because they've been studying it, they were like, well, is that a tsunami? Is that a tidal wave? Or is it just a really big wave? Is it just a great wave? It was interesting hearing the students talk about it, and the students particularly that were researching tsunamis, they were like, well, there's people in those boats, you know, and how many people? And we later found out there was like about 10 people in each boat. And they started talking about scale. Well, if those are people, wow, that really is a big wave. And I think people that studied scale said that it must be like 30 to 40 feet high. But whether or not it's a tsunami, it certainly is a great wave and certainly a disaster for these people in these boats. Let's look at the next one. What do we have here? This might take a little more thinking.
Is it an earthquake?
Earthquake, yeah, I think so.
We've got several people saying earthquake, and you all are correct. This is from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and this was interesting because it is an actual photograph by Edith Irvine, who some of the students had been reading about in Earthquake at Dawn. And so they got excited about that was actually from one of the characters in their book. What might we have here?
Fire.
Or?
All right. Yeah, if you're looking real closely, we've got like a fire back here, which again caused some conversation from the students in Monica's class. There was this conversation about, well, lots of things cause fires, and we're supposed to be focused on natural disasters. Could it be a campfire that somebody let out? Could it be did somebody throw a cigarette down? And as they look closer, what did they notice probably?
It looks like lightning.
Yeah, there's this visual cue that this probably is a natural wildfire with this lightning strike up there, perhaps. And this is the prairie fire. This next image was trickier for the folks in Georgia than it was for my Floridians. And this is also kind of an iconic image. what might be the disaster here for this person who's clearly in a world of trouble with the sharks and everything.
A
But what
water
might,
spout?
Water spout. Okay, I was gonna say water spout. The
yeah,
hurricane.
Water spout.
Hurricane.
right. And that was tricky for some of the kids at Georgia, whereas a lot of us in coastal Florida, you know, I've been to Clearwater Beach and you see the water spout way out there, or maybe you've been elsewhere. I've seen one in the Bahamas once, but yeah, a water spout. With some of the kids in the Georgia, we talked a little about, well, what is a water spout? You know, is it like a tornado over the water? And of course, this is Winslow Homer's The Gulf Stream. The next one is a contemporary image and the most abstract of them all.
A flood?
Insurrection?
Interesting. I hear insurrection and I hear flood. For the person that said flood, and because I can't see your faces right now, what made you think of flood?
The wavy lines on the bottom and the foreground?
All right. So we
And
got
the
some.
people turned upside down?
I see earthquake. I see earthquake.
All right.
There's like a roof and a chimney maybe in the background.
A roof and maybe a chimney. So what would that indicate to you if this is a roof and a chimney?
They're looking for higher ground.
Okay, excellent. So this was trickier for the students to grapple with, although it was closer to when Katrina had happened, being 2007, just 2 years afterwards. So some of those images were in some of the kids' minds, and some of the kids had cousins or somebody that had to relocate from nearby Louisiana. So eventually we did figure out that this is Kara Walker's image called Post-Katrina Adrift, which was featured on the cover of the New Yorker in 2007 as the second anniversary after Hurricane Katrina. And I want to give you a little bit more context about this image because this might spur us on in deeper reflection here in a bit. And this is the, prior to this New Yorker image in 2006, Kara Walker had put together an exhibit both as an artist and a curator at the Met called After the Deluge. And I'll just read you the exhibition overview that the Met released about that exhibition. It says, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, contemporary American artist Kara Walker, who is an African-American and is widely recognized for her explorations of issues of race, gender, and sexuality through the use of 18th century medium of cut paper silhouettes, has selected a variety of objects from the museum's collection that she juxtaposes with her own work in order to explore the banality of everyday life, water, and its impact. Taking her cue from another painting, J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. And also Winslow Homer's sensitive depictions of Black life in 19th century America. Walker's aim is to simultaneously address the transformative effect and the psychological meaning of the sea and the role of the Black figure as they are represented in art. The narrative created through the combination of these desperate images gives rise to a foreboding sense of doom. In her work, Walker unleashes the traditional proper Victorian medium of silhouette directly onto the walls of the gallery, creating a theatrical space in which her cut paper characters cavort seemingly with one foot in the historical reality of slavery and the other in a nightmarish space that suggests the world of romantic novels. Among those works in the Metropolitan's American Art Collection that Walker incorporated into the exhibit is the Gulf Stream, which we saw a minute earlier by Winslow Homer. And also the Deluge towards its close was also included. And I'm keeping my eye on the time, but I'm going to go ahead and add this bit. In a separate article in Studio International, Cindy DiMarzo said this about the exhibit After the Deluge. The image of water, the main character in the drama of Hurricane Katrina, is apparent in many pieces here and functions as a connection of desperate thoughts, emotions, and observations. Water is fluid, strong, and flexible. It can cause great destruction and withstand great challenge. Water can also flush out hidden debris and clear out the dirt that soils personal and collective histories. Like all tragedies, Katrina brought people together and sparked moving public displays of emotion. but there is, in Walker's terminology, a murky area. And then the author wrote this: while the most blatant forms of prejudice continue to recede into the past, and I would argue that we found out that's not true, but the author did say, while the most blatant forms of prejudice continue to recede into the past, the shame and self-hatred which all forms of prejudice generate remain. Referring to what she says is a line of thinking similar to Black people, and Kara Walker said, all you have to do in this world is stay Black and die. Kara Walker instead says, instead of sitting very still, staying Black and waiting to die, I've asked each piece to take a step beyond its own borders, to connect a series of thoughts together related to fluidity and the failure of containment. So this is perhaps you're smelling that in the air. Perhaps this is a bit of foreshadowing of where we can do some critical reflection. But for now, let's move forward and let's continue following how Monica and I did this unit back in 2007. So here's all 6 of the images we showed. And I will add just a little bit of a critical interlude here. That the first time I taught this lesson in the 90s, I only used this image, this image, this image, and this image. So I had 4 images by men, 3 of which were white men. So if we just take a little critical interlude on what I taught in the 2000s and focus on critical reflection, that I did see in that in-between period that there were opportunities to offer better representation of other populations. And so I added, for this version along with Monica, we added 2 women, Edith Irvine and of course Kara Walker, who is a Black artist. But back to the script. We talked with the students then after we looked at all 6 images, and we named 6 disasters so far. And we asked them, what other natural disasters can you name? We've got the tornado, the earthquake, the wildfire, the tsunami, a hurricane/flood, and also the waterspout. Anything you all want to add to that list?
Yeah, yeah, because I'm Italian, so I would certainly add Pompeii.
Excellent. And the students also had several to add, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. I see we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. We also asked the students, besides the natural disasters, what else are in all of these artworks? What do you all see that's in every single one of them?
People.
People. Yep, they've all got people in them. So that led us to our next question, which is what emotions or feelings are being shown in these people in reaction to the natural disasters. Let's just get 1 or 2 comments from you all about a specific emotion that one of these people might be experiencing.
Fear?
Fear. Is there a certain person that you think is showing fear?
Well, a lot of them not looking very happy.
There's several, right? There's several.
Yeah.
You can see fear in faces here. You can see fear. For whatever reason, and we can talk later about gender representation, this figure is very pale and looks passed out. What's another emotion besides fear?
Kelly Dupree wrote stress in the chat box.
Stress.
I think
I wonder if
Sebastian in the chat has come up.
Thank you, Sarah.
I also see collaboration and togetherness coming together.
And you see that in some more than others, don't you?
Yes.
Worry and panic.
Panic, worry. I love it. I love it. It's interesting.
Shock and despair. Sorry. Shock and despair in the chat. Surrender.
Shock and despair. And just for the sake of time, we'll stop there. But we charted all this up on the whiteboard, the list of the disasters and how they're reacting. And people did say strength. Somebody, I think one of the 5th graders said, oh, they gave up, somebody's given up. And I might amend that to resignation, maybe if this was your facility. But they had a wonderful list of emotions. Then we followed that up with a very, very simple question that I borrowed from Terry Barrett Hayes. I'm sorry, from Terry Barrett, which is a very simple question. If you think it's showing fear or despair or anguish, how do you know? And that's a simple question, but a very effective one. How do you know that somebody's showing this particular emotion? And now you're really looking at the work of art to see what those cues are. For the sake of time, as much as I wanted to be interactive, I'm going to just show you what the fifth graders came up with. And this is in the words of fifth graders. And if you are scaling it up or down, I think you can take it lots of other directions. So they talked about the pose of the figures. They talked about facial expression. They did talk about color, and that came up in a couple instances. And I think there are other things that you could come up with, particularly if you're scaling it up and down, related to composition or line quality or any number of things. And I'm just speeding up a little bit, so bear with me because I've got my eye on time. We wanted to stick to what the students recognized, but I do think one way to scale up or down is to do that. So then we had students plan their own natural disasters art project, and we sort of based it off what the students told us. We asked them to choose a natural disaster to show in their art project. We said that their art project must show at least one person. The person in your art project should be showing a feeling or emotion in reaction to the natural disaster. And they had to come up with a way that they were showing that emotion, that they were depicting it in their work of art. They had to come up with that. And they were given some choice in artistic media. And here's where I think this lesson could be adaptable for students working from home, because this could be just a simple drawing exercise. And in fact, I was coming to visit her class from the University of Georgia. She wasn't an art teacher. Monica didn't have tons of supplies in her room. So I would schlep over some watercolors and things like that. But we were limited in the media we had as well too. So let's jump in and see where this went. I will go rather quickly here. We did ask the students to plan out those elements before beginning their work. So they did have a little planning sheet so that they were being thoughtful about starting the project. And you can see some students did pick different media, and I could tell some stories about how they picked their media, but for the sake of time, I'll go a little bit quicker. And I did enjoy coming to her classrooms on Fridays. I do enjoy being in the classroom, K-12 classrooms, love observing our student teachers currently. So let's take a look at some of the students' art. We'll do this fast, but somebody tell me what the disaster might be in this image.
Volcano.
Yeah, that was one we could have added to our list. And how do you think the student might have been showing emotion or trying to show emotion?
With the eye expression?
Yeah, in the face. And I'll go ahead and add that I also remember the student at least telling me that there was an attempt here to have these sort of clutched fists in anguish as well too. But that's what she was working on there. What disaster might we have here?
That's a flood.
Yeah, and you've got the pose with one person submerged in the water, the other clinging to an automobile, reaching out to them. We've got a tornado here, and while the pose might not be as dynamic, I do love that hair kind of blowing in the wind. These are some older images from when I taught it in the 90s. So we've got a wildfire, another volcano, a little flourish here in the earthquake where the crack in the earth is actually separating the dog from the owner and the skateboard. Anyone know what this one is?
It's quicksand.
That is quicksand. And I remember talking to a student, how is this a disaster? It's like, it's a natural disaster. It's not on a large scale, but it's disastrous for these two people. And I do love the attempts to show this person kneeling and then reaching for each other and the anguish in the face. Like I said, I got my eye on the time, so I'm going to go quick here. As the students wrapped up their projects, we did Monica returned to language arts and had the students not just read about natural disasters, but also write about it. And she did have a planning sheet to help them organize their thoughts. And the notion was for students to use their artwork as a jumping off point for this story. And I'll quickly share just one story that they wrote. Here's the student's story as a fifth grader. It came out of nowhere. Boom! People ran screaming and people tried to get to safety. But the Brown family had no idea until Susan, their 4-year-old daughter, told them that she had heard some screaming. They looked out the door when Jacob, their younger son, said, "Run! Tornado!" "Where is a safe place?" asked Kim, the mother. "I know," said Jim, the father. "The basement." They ran to safety, so they thought. Susan felt the storm getting stronger. The family was scared. They could still hear the loud shriek of the townspeople. Thankfully, the storm went away after a while. The Brown family ran out of the house, and they thought they were going to get in their truck, but the tornado had took it, and so they ended up walking to town. Half of the town was gone, and even the mayor was killed by the dreadful tornado. The townspeople were glad the storm was over, but the Browns were very sad because they loved the mayor like a brother. And so you see in the efforts of some of the students' work, trying to relate this to real life and to real things that happen to people. We weren't always as successful, and I will just give you a hint of the basic surface critical reflection that Monica and I looked at. We made one tactical surface error when a couple of students came to us and said, "Hey, can I put more than one disaster in my work of art?" And we said, "Well, why?" And the student explained to us, well, often they do come in tandem. For example, Hurricane Katrina was a hurricane, but the floods afterwards were very devastating that came along with it. So they justified why they had multiple disasters in their images, and we allowed that. But it did result in some other students that sat around them to start adding additional disasters into their work. In hindsight, what we should have done was then make a blanket announcement to the class that, if you planned on showing more than one disaster, to check with us and check with your sources to make sure it's accurate. I'll scoot over a couple questions, images here so we can get to the final reflection so I can stay on time. So now, as we wrap this up, let's revisit those different levels of teacher reflection, whether they dealt with the surface level on classroom management, or whether it had to do with whether our goals matched how we interacted the unit, or whether we got deeper into social justice issues, or even started to think about our own assumptions and our own acknowledged cultural privileges. Let's spend the last 5-6 minutes that we have here talking about this lesson reflectively and critically, and how it could be improved upon. And I'll give you some prompts to think about as you may just spur you along. If you think about our overall main purpose, the idea that natural disasters are real events that impact real lives, and the resulting devastation to humankind should be a real concern to all. How could our project have been expanded to better achieve that main goal? I feel like we left something off the table that was huge. And other prompts, how could future projects be expanded to address these related themes that I mentioned earlier about care, empathy, and compassion? What opportunities to explore social justice or service learning were left off of the table? How could this project be scaled up or down to reach other age groups? And what other examples or media should we have used, and what else? So we got about 5 minutes, which isn't much time, but after this, it's just my goodbye slide. So let's just open it up with those prompts, or even something else that you thought of. If we're to use those levels of critical reflection, how could this be improved upon? How could we be more critical and take an old idea and dust it off and update it for these critical times we live in?
I could see everyone doing the coronavirus.
And I thought somebody would bring that up. And I started thinking today as I was going over this, how would I respond if we were doing that? How would I respond to it? But it is a natural type of disaster, pandemic. And so that opens up lots of possibilities. I knew somebody was going to say that.
If you scaled it up to a higher grade level, could they focus in on the piece of your main idea of addressing humankind?
I definitely think there's hi, Lorinda, by the way. It's good. Thanks for joining
Hello.
us. It's glad you could make it. I definitely think that there are ripe opportunities for for addressing humankind, care, empathy, and compassion. Does anyone have any idea how you might do that?
I think a good way might be to ask the students how they feel in response to these natural disasters. What are their personal emotions and what mood is reflected? And then segue into, so what might someone else feel?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for joining us. It does seem like there's opportunities that we left off the table to go deeper with that sense of care and empathy and compassion for others and the results for humankind. Let's get a couple more.
I was thinking maybe they could talk about specifically how it impacts them personally or somebody that's close to them, like a family member or somebody that's a friend, close friend.
I'm hearing from some good friends of mine right now. Hi, Zarek.
Hey, how's it going?
Thanks for joining us. And that happened a little bit when they wrote their stories or when they would talk, more often to Monica. The students had good rapport with Monica. She had looped with her class from 4th to 5th grade. And some of them did have stories of family members and cousins that had relocated or experienced Katrina. And I think that there's some ripe opportunities there. I also think if something very disturbing came up that you may be ready to work with a counselor or somebody like that should it be a triggering discussion for them. Maybe one or two more. I know we're down to almost the last minute.
Maybe talk about safety preparedness, like what would you do to prepare for one of the disasters, that maybe if you lived in a certain area of the country or, where tornadoes were more frequent or things like that.
Absolutely. When we lived in Texas, the tornado was a concern versus the hurricane. And that was new to me. I had to learn how to be prepared for those. I'm going to put Amber or Sarah or Rachel on the spot here. Did you come up with any ideas related to maybe Kara Walker's exhibit that you would do with secondary students?
I'll brag on Alexandra Allen, who's one of our graduates now at Penn State, working up there. But she just put in the chat that there's an opening to have some conversations about how natural disasters impact some communities and populations differently than others. Looking at Sarah Ackerman said perhaps maybe looking at media coverage. I think there's a really nice opportunity to have students think about how natural disasters play out in different places and how do we respond as a country and as a community and on the large scale and small scale when natural disasters happen. And I think about the hurricane in Puerto Rico versus how we respond to hurricanes in the States. And I think there's an opportunity to maybe unpack that with students.
Well done, Alex and Sarah and everyone else that contributed. Lots of wonderful ideas. And this wasn't a right or wrong. What it is to stimulate you all to think about how an old idea can be dusted off and improved to go deeper. And I do. Yes.
Sorry, a quick question. I don't know if I missed this. I would like to ask how to deal with the idea of death in terms of, preparing the students that, especially because I understand this was a grade 5 class. So how do we prepare them properly to make sure that they deal with the concept of death?
I would say that that's where you have to, or at least I would have to realize my own limitations. I'm not a counselor. And so that I can't be their therapist, nor could Monica. But we needed to be prepared for that possibility. And we did have a general inclination that these students we were working with hadn't experienced death in that way because Monica had looped with them the year before and she had good rapport. My advice would be to talk to whatever resources your school community has in advance of the lesson, letting them know this project is coming. And should it serve as a triggering event, to let the experts with you serving as a go-between, but to let people that are trained in that to address that with you, because it is a very likely possibility, although we entered into this knowing or suspecting that that wouldn't be the case. But I'm glad you brought that up. I think sometimes in the arts, because the arts have therapeutic values, sometimes we, out of good intentions, want to be the therapist, but most of us are not licensed art therapists. This is that image of the slave throwers throwing overboard the dead and the dying. I did want to show that. I do agree with Sarah Ackerman and Alex Allen and Sarah Scott Shields, that there are opportunities to go that social justice route. I would also say there's opportunities for community engagement and community service. I mean, at the very least, you could take action for helping out a community that has experienced a disaster and finding some ways to contribute to them. And if it's not a local event, even some sort of effort to perhaps raise money. And it could even be through your artwork. Because I want to respect your time, I want to thank you all for being interactive and for asking so many great questions, but I know it's late, and thank you for staying with me. And how awesome to hear so many friends that are here in the audience. Sarah, I'm going to stop screen sharing in case you have anything else to say, but I'll stay on here until I'm not needed anymore.
I think, you know, the only thing I have to add is how much we really appreciate this, Jeff. This is such a timely lesson and something that I think teachers could take into their classrooms right now and talk about the natural disaster that we're all living through. So I really appreciate the presentation. It was really well done. So a round of applause from all over where everybody is. So thank you so much.